Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey. We are going to be learning today Miras Hashem Daf Kuf Chav Zayin Amud Beis. We will be completing Siman Taf Kuf Yud, and maybe we will even begin Siman Taf Kuf Yud Aleph. So we pick up on the very bottom line of Kuf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, Siman Taf Kuf Yud Sif Ches. Says the Mechaber. Even though the malacha of haitzah, what we colloquially call carrying, transferring something from one rishus to another rishus, carrying something dalad amas in rishus harabim, even though that's a malacha that is mutter on Yom Tov, and not only is it mutter on Yom Tov l'tzarich Yom Tov, it's also mutter even shaloi l'tzarich, as long as there's somewhat of a tzarich for Yom Tov, it's mutter. It doesn't mean shaloi l'tzarich completely. It doesn't mean that you're allowed to carry for absolutely no reason at all. But at least it is as if there's some tzarich for Yom Tov, the malacha of haitzah is mutter. Still, says the Mechaber, lo yisama sois gedolos. You should not carry large burdens kederech shehu oisa b'chayil, in the same manner that you would carry them during the week. Ella, rather, tzarech l'shanois. If you're going to carry a large, heavy burden, you have to change the way you would carry it. Let's take a look first at the Mishnah Berurah over here. Mishnah Berurah begins on Kuf Chav Zayin Amud Beis. Oh, actually, there is no Mishnah Berurah yet. Okay, let's go weiter. So, for example, the Mechaber says, Hamevi kade yayin mimakom lemakom. If somebody is transporting jugs of wine from one place to another, lo yaviem besal ubekupa. He should not bring them using a large basket or some other kind of large container, laseis l'soichai arba oy chamisha kadim, so that he could put 4 or 5 jugs of wine inside a box and carry the box. Ella, rather yaviem al kisefai. Rather, he should carry one jug at a time on his shoulder, or he could carry them in front of him, 1 or 2 kadim at once, and by carrying it in this way, it's clear that he's doing it for Yom Tov purposes, and it's not just uvda d'chayil. Says the Mishnah Berurah over here, as Chav Ches, lo yaviem basal. He's transporting a lot of jugs of wine. He shouldn't put a whole bunch of them into a basket. Afilu l'tzarish tias hayom. Says the Chavetz Chaim, this is true even if you need those jugs of wine for today, for Yom Tov, for the Suda. Umashma ma'avodas hakodesh. The implication from the Rashba and the Avodas hakodesh is da afilu im yirtze litain b'soich hasal rak shnayim. Let's say you only have 2 jugs of wine that you want to transport. You're not trying to transport a half a dozen jugs of wine, and it's just easier for you to put them in a box. Gam kain aser, that's still forbidden. To who uvda the chayil, because the problem over here is that carrying items, transporting items in that way, it looks like you just came back from a big shopping trip. That looks like an uvda the chayil, and that's not something that you should do on Yom Tov. Says the Chavetz Chaim, it could be that the Mechaber also holds that even 1 or 2 jugs of wine shouldn't be transported in a large box. And when the Mechaber wrote Arba or Chamisha Kadim, 4 or 5 jugs, it wasn't Dafka 4 or 5. He just means if you're trying to transport multiple jugs of wine, don't do it in a large box. Do it rather by hand. Why did he write 4 or 5? Because that's the more traditional. That's the typical case would be that somebody is trying to transport 4 or 5 jugs, he would seek to use a box. Somebody carrying 2 wouldn't go ahead to use a box. Ice cut and chavtes. No, we didn't do that yet. Says the Ramah, the 3rd line down from the top. This halacha that you have to take care of how you transport multiple jugs or other large quantities of items, that only pertains when you're transporting them from one place to another place through the Rishus Harabim. Aval mizavis lizavis. But if you're doing it inside your house, from one side of the basement to the other side of the basement, aymi bias labias ba'isei chotzer, or you're going from one house to another in the same chotzer, so you're in the bungalow colony and you're moving something within the bungalow colony from one building to another, shari b'chal inyan, then this is not negeya, then it's mutter. Says the Chavetz Chaim is cut mechavtes b'makom lamakom. This halacha only pertains when you're moving things from one place to another place. Hainu b'mavuos. We're talking here in the streets and in the alleyways of Rishus Harabim. Teshchichi be'rabim, with it's common for there to be a lot of people out and about, and they're going to see what you're doing. Umechzi kov the dechayil, and when they see you transporting this in a big box, it looks like an uvda dechayil. However, if you're doing it inside your own house, or you're doing it from one house to another in the same chutzner, then the Ramah said, Ois katan lamed shari b'chal inyan. Then this is completely mutter. Afilu yoser me'arba v'chamisha kadim. Even if you're trying to move more than 4 or 5 jugs, even if you're trying to move a dozen jugs of wine, you could certainly put them in a big box and move them. And not just that, says the Chavetz Chaim, v'adarabba, quite the opposite. Yoser toivu l'haylech harbe b'yachad. If you're doing it within your house or within the chutzner, it's actually it's preferable that you should put them into a large box and move them at one time. That's better than moving the jugs 1 or 2 at a time and having to make many more trips. That's a tircha yisera on Yom Tov. So again, the point of this halacha is, and I think I mentioned once, because we had a very similar halacha back in Siman Taf Tzadik Ches, when we were talking about somebody who's butchering up a whole animal, and he has to transport all the meat from the animal at one time. So I mentioned back then, I had a case when I lived in Edison, and I was making a kiddush in the shul, and I had to move 2-liter bottles of soda from my house to the shul, and there's an Erev. So I'm going 3-4 blocks to the shul. It would be a lot easier to take the 2-liter bottles of soda, put them into the cases, the plastic cases, stack them up on a hand truck, and move them on a hand truck. And what's the problem? There's an Erev. There's no problem with Hitzah, but the problem is that's uvda dechayil. Somebody sees you going down the street with a hand truck with 4 cases of 2-liter soda bottles. That looks very much like an uvda dechayil. That's a gnai for Yom Tov. Matter of fact, if you take a look in the Sharetzion Ois Katan Lamed, he brings down over here. I'm sorry, no, not Lamed. Where did I see it? I saw this lashon. Yeah, if you take a look at Sharetzion Ois Katan Lamed Gimel, it's actually on the next sif, but it's speaking about the same type of halacha. He says over here, Rashi hit him oid yoser. Rashi adds to the explanation of this iser, shehu gnai liyomtiv, that to go down the street like that with a hand truck with cases of 2-liter soda bottles is a gnai liyomtiv. Shenire shemiskavein lemalacha rabba. It looks like you're engaged in some kind of a commercial enterprise over here. Or it looks like you're just engaged in very much weekday activity. That is certainly not Yom Tov dik to go down the street with a hand truck. So instead, we transported the 2-liter soda bottles to the kiddush, a couple of bottles at a time. That's it, because of this halacha. Okay, now we go to Sif Tes, which is basically, it's built on the same halacha. Says the Mechaber, HaMoilech es HaTeven, somebody who needs to transport Teven. Maybe he has to feed his animals. He should not cast the box over his shoulder. Rather, he should carry it in front of him in his hands. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Again, the reason for this halacha is we don't want you to take the box in the normal way over your shoulder, because again, that looks like uvda dechayil. Sif Yud. Similarly, if you have a large burden where typically it is carried on a pole, so like you have a pole over your shoulder, and that's how you carry this large burden, you should rather forego the pole, forego the mite, and carry it on your back. Make a shinui. If it's a large burden that typically would be carried on your back, carry it on your shoulder. A burden that would typically be carried on the shoulder, carry it in your arms in front of you. or Yifrais Aleihen Beged, or at least throw some kind of a cloth or a canvas over it. Do something to make a shinoi. Do something to make a shinoi in the way you're carrying this burden. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut lamed beis v'chein masoi shedarkon kol zeh kedei l'shanos miderech chayil. The point over here in all of these halachas is that we want to carry the burden in a different way than it's typically carried during the weekday, because we don't want this to look like an uvda d'chayil. Ois cut lamed gimel, or what the Mechaber suggested was yifrais aleihen beged. Spread out some kind of a beged over the burden that you're carrying, to make a siman, make a shinoi of some kind. The Chavetz Chaim points out that if you're going to throw some kind of a beged over what you're carrying, it must be, we're talking about something that's dry, like dry fruits, or by wine. Chavetz Chaim is pointing out over here that if you're throwing a beged, if you're throwing cloth over the burden, then he's saying it must be that we're talking about something dry. We're talking about dry goods, not wet goods where the garment that you're throwing over the package is going to get wet. That could be a potential problem because it might come to schita and then libun. It could be if you throw a beged, you throw a jacket over the burden that you're carrying and it gets all wet, and you might wring it out when you get to wherever you're going, and that would be a problem of the malacha of libun, of laundering. So he's suggesting over here, it must be the Mechaber is talking about dry goods. Kamavur b'siman shin yud tesif yud. Avo b'mayim, if you're talking about carrying water, ein lifrais beged milamala, you can't put a beged over open jugs of water, to lo yipal b'mayim, lest the beged fall into the water, v'yaver l'dei schita, and then you'll wring it out, and that will be a problem of the malacha of schita and libun. He suggests that by wine, that wouldn't be a problem, because wine, if you wring it out, you're not washing the garment. It's going to remain stained red. Okay, says the Mechaber Viter. By me, it's 3 lines off the end of the Siman, right by the Ois Katan Lamed Daled for the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mechaber, Ve'im Efsher. If it's not possible for you to make a shinoi in the way you're carrying these burdens, or it's not possible for you to do what the Mechaber suggested in Sivches, it's not possible for you to carry the 2-liter soda bottles one at a time. You have to put them all in a big box. Why? So the Mechaber says, Kigoin, for example, Shezimein harbe orchim, maybe you have a lot of guests waiting for you. V'tzarech lemaheru lahavi lefneim, and you have to hurry up and bring the soda for the Suda. You have 60, 70 guests that are sitting and waiting, and they're already sitting and waiting. The Suda has to start, so you don't have time to patchka to bring the bottles 2 at a time. So v'tzarech lemaheru lahavi lefneim. Then the Mechaber says, Oiseh kedarkai. Then you could do it in the normal way. You could do it in a box or in a basket. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Daled ve'im yefsher kegayin v'hu adin. The same halacha would apply. Im yefsher lo l'shanos v'pnei siba acheres. Maybe there's another reason why you can't do it. Kegayin she'en lo beged l'chasais. Very nice. You're telling me throw a beged over the burden. I don't have a beged that I could throw over it. L'chahai gavna. If you have to hurry up to bring the food to your guests, and if you'll do it in the normal way by putting them all into a box and carrying it at once, you'll get them the food much faster. So then you do it in the normal way. The Chavetz Chaim applies, the Chavetz Chaim states, like I said previously, that this applies also to the halacha that the Mechaber said in Sivches, that you're not mechuyev to carry the 2-liter soda bottles 2 at a time. You could put them in a box if it means getting it to the guests faster. If you invited a lot of guests, and you have to bring all the soda or all the wine to them quickly, then you're allowed to put 4 or 5 jugs into a box at once. And the Mishnah Berurah says, V'archim, and when we speak about guests, about archim in the context of this halacha, V'archim nikra l'inyan zeh afilu me'oisa ha'ir. When we're talking about archim in this context, We mean even if they're people who live in the same city, in the same locale as you, and they're not sleeping by you. That's the point. They're just coming to you for the Suda. But that's also called Archim in the context of this halacha. Says the Mechaber Weiter, by me it's in the middle of the second line off the end of the Siman, in the middle of the line. Pamed Dvarim Amurim, when are all of these halachas said? Benoisei al ha'adam, we're talking about packages that are being carried by a person manually. Aval al gabe behema lo yavi klal, but you're not allowed to transport burdens on an animal on Yom Tov at all. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Lamed Vav lo yavi klal. Hatam ayin le'el b'simin tav tzadikei siv gimel. We discussed this in Siman tav tzadikei with Mishnah Berurah Sham, and if I remember correctly, the Mishnah Berurah mentioned machlokes rishonim. There's two possible reasons why it's usher to transport packages with an animal on Yom Tov. There are those shittas of the rishonim that hold that there's a chiyuv of shvisas behemtai on Yom Tov. The same way on Shabbos you're not allowed to have your animal do malacha, so too on Yom Tov you're not allowed to have your animal do malacha. Then there are those Rishonim who hold that there is no Isser Shvisas Behemtai on Yom Tov, and rather the problem of using an animal is Uvda D'Chayil. Okay, finally, the final sif in this Siman, Sif Yud Aleph, says the Mechaber, Ein Mevi'in Eitzim. You're not allowed to transport firewood, Loi B'chevel, not by tying them together with a rope, V'loi B'kupa, not by putting them into a basket, and not by wrapping them up in a reed mat. But you could do it in a non-typical fashion. You could wrap it up in some kind of a mitpachas, which is like a kerchief, or you could carry it, on your chest, carrying them in your arms. That you could do. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Lamed Zayin, Ein Mevi'in Eitzim. What the Mechaber over here wants to say is, if you remember earlier, we had a whole siman speaking about which firewood is muktzah on Yom Tov, which firewood is not muktzah, where you're allowed to take wood from. Are you allowed to take wood from the backyard, from the storage yard? Are you allowed to collect wood from the chutzner? We had a whole siman discussing this. Now the Mechaber is telling you, even if you're taking firewood from a locale where you are permitted to take firewood from, still you're not allowed to carry it in these typical ways. Still, you should not tie them up in a rope and carry it in that fashion. Because we don't want you to transport the firewood in the typical fashion that you would do on a regular weekday. Okay, now let's begin Siman Taf Kuf Yud Aleph. Havara, the malacha of making a fire, or lahache mayim, or to heat up water. Mutter b'yom tov. These are malachas that are mutter on Yom Tov. They're permissible. Ubay dalet seifim, and here we have 4 seifim. Says the Mechaber, mutter lasois medura lehischamim kenegda. You're allowed to light up a fire, make a nice little bonfire, in order to warm yourself up against that fire. So you're not doing this for cooking. This is not typical oichel nefesh. You're doing it to warm yourself up. You're allowed to do that. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this is a very yisaidistic Mishnah Berurah over here, a nice cut in Aleph. Mutar lasais medura. Explains the Chavetz Chaim, the af tiksiv b'Torah. Even though it says in the pasuk in the Torah Hagdosha, ach asher yeyachel l'chol nefesh hu levado yeyosel lachem. Even though the pasuk says, ach asher yeyachel l'chol nefesh, only malacha that's being done for preparation of food, hu levado yeyosel lachem. That's the only malacha that's mutter to do on Yom Tov. So the pasuk seems to say very clearly, only for food preparation. Only malacha that's required to feed people. So what does this have to do with making a fire to warm yourself up? Nevertheless, explains the Chavetz Chaim, Kaimalad we paskin de mitoich shehutra havara l'tzarech eichel nefesh, that since the malacha of havara, since the malacha of making a fire is mutter for eichel nefesh, hutter af shaloi l'tzarech eichel nefesh. It's also mutter even for not eichel nefesh. Ubilavad sheyehi shava l'chol nefesh v'tzarech Yom Tov. As long as there is a Yom Tov need, and you're making the fire for a davar hashava l'chol nefesh, for something that the vast majority of people need. So heating yourself up during the winter, that's a davar hashava l'chol nefesh. Everybody needs heat during the winter. So that's a davar hashava l'chol nefesh. Then you're allowed to do it. Now the Chavetz Chaim brings down another sheet of Yeshayimrim. There are those that say, and this is the Rashba, the Avodas HaKodesh, the Bach. It seems that other Rishonim hold this way as well. The Yeshayimrim, the Chol Midi Dahanas Haguf, anything that is for physical pleasure, the Chlal Achashe Yeyachel L'chol Nefeshu, is included in the pasuk of Achashe Yeyachel L'chol Nefesh. So it's not only food preparation that's called Eichel Nefesh, but anything else that benefits the guf, like heat, is also called Eichel Nefesh. Varak sheyeh shava l'chol nefesh, but it still has to be something that the vast majority of people all benefit from. It's all something that they consider something necessary for Yom Tov. Okay, a very short share today. We're going to stop over here. Mirza Hashem will continue Sunday morning with the words of the Ramah. Everybody should have a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos. Like I've been saying constantly, the Rebbeinu Shalom should check Yeshuas and Refuas and Parnasa to all those in need. We should see the end of all of these tsaras. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Refuas. The Rebbeinu Shalom should be Megan on Gans Klal Yisrael. And the Schus of Torah should be Magen on us. Everyone should have a Ksiva, V'chsima, Tova, a good gebenched yar. And we're going to Slichas, Motzei Shabbos. So Mirza Hashem, the Tfilos should be Mekubal. Be well.